The letter arrived on a Wednesday. A plain white envelope, no return address, slipped through the mail slot of a modest brick house on Sycamore Lane in Harlan's Crossing, Virginia, a house that had stood for 51 years, that had seen 4 presidents, 2 wars, and 1 very long marriage. Inside that envelope was a single sheet of paper, a formal offer, typed in clean, corporate font. $1. That was what Dominic Hargrove, CEO of Hargrove Capital Partners, net worth estimated at $230 million, believed the home of Sergeant First Class Eugene Ray Tillman, United States Army, retired, was worth. $1. Eugene read the letter twice, folded it along its original crease, set it on the kitchen table beside his morning coffee, looked out the window at the oak tree his late wife Dorothy had planted the year their daughter was born. Then he picked up the phone and made a call that would change everything. Let me tell you about Harlan's Crossing, Virginia. It sits 43 miles southwest of Richmond, tucked between the Blue Ridge foothills and the slow green bend of the Appomattox River. Population, 11,412. The kind of town where the hardware store has been owned by the same family since 1958. Where the Friday night football game is still the social event of the week, where people leave their screen doors unlocked until October. Sycamore Lane was the prettiest street in Harlan's Crossing. 12 houses, 6 on each side, old oaks arching overhead like a cathedral ceiling. In the spring, the dogwoods bloomed white and pink along the curb. In the summer, sprinklers threw rainbows across St. Augustine grass. In the fall, the leaves turned copper and crimson and covered the sidewalks like a painting someone had dropped and never bothered to pick up. The neighbors on Sycamore Lane knew each other's names. They returned each other's trash cans. They brought casseroles when someone was sick and champagne when someone graduated. At Christmas, they strung lights on the oaks and left their porch lamps burning all night so the street glowed like something out of a postcard. It was the kind of place people spend their whole lives looking for. For 31 years, it had been Eugene Tillman's home. And in the summer of 2019, a man arrived who believed that things like history and memory and 31 years of a life lived with dignity were simply obstacles to be purchased and removed. He was wrong. Sergeant First Class Eugene Ray Tillman, United States Army, retired. Born March 14, 1948 in Danville, Virginia, the second of 5 children. His father worked the railroad. His mother cleaned houses. Eugene was the first in his family to finish high school. He enlisted the week after graduation, June of 1966, age 18. He served 24 years, 4 overseas deployments. Vietnam 1967 to 1969, attached to the 1st Cavalry Division out of Nkhi. He didn't talk about what happened there. He didn't need to. You could see it sometimes in the way he paused before answering a question, as though he was measuring the weight of every word before he let it leave his mouth. He carried himself the way men do when they've learned that stillness can save your life. He came home from Vietnam with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, a piece of North Vietnamese shrapnel still lodged 3 millimeters from his left femoral artery, too dangerous to remove, and a permanent left side limp that got worse in cold weather. He re-enlisted, served again during the Gulf War 1990 to 1991, in a logistics and intelligence capacity that he was not at liberty to discuss in detail, even 30 years later. He retired in 1992 as a Sergeant First Class with the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He and Dorothy moved to Harlan's Crossing in 1988 while he was still active duty. They'd driven through on a Sunday afternoon, stopped for gas, and Dorothy had seen Sycamore Lane through the car window. "This is it," she'd said. "This is where we're going to grow old." She was right about Sycamore Lane. She was wrong about growing old. Cancer took her in 2011, a Thursday in November, the same month the oak tree in the front yard lost its leaves for what felt like the last time. Eugene stayed. He stayed because the house was Dorothy's house, and leaving it felt like leaving her. He stayed because their daughter Renee lived 40 minutes away in Lynchburg and brought the grandkids every other Sunday. He stayed because old men who have earned their peace deserve to keep it. He was 71 years old in the summer of 2019. He walked with a cane when the humidity was bad. He kept a small workshop in the garage where he built birdhouses and end tables that he gave away to neighbors and to the veterans' shelter in Richmond. He drank his coffee black at 5:45 every morning, in a ceramic mug Dorothy had painted for him in 1979. The mug said "MY Soldier" in chipped blue letters. He had a dog named Corporal, a 9-year-old brindle mutt with one cloudy eye and an opinion about everything. Every evening, Eugene sat on the front porch in a worn wooden rocker and watched the neighborhood settle into dark. He waved at every car, he knew every face. And everyone on Sycamore Lane knew one thing about Eugene Ray Tillman. You didn't disrespect him. Not because he was frightening, he wasn't particularly. Not because he would raise his voice, he rarely did. But because men like Eugene Ray Tillman have already paid for their peace, and there is something in their eyes when that peace is threatened that tells you, very quietly, that they are not finished yet. The moving truck came on a Saturday in late June. Not just one truck, 3 big white 18-wheelers with Executive Relocation SCRVICES printed on the side in gold letters. They parked on both sides of Sycamore Lane without courtesy cones, without permission, blocking 4 driveways including Eugene's. Behind them came the SUV. A pearl white 2020 Cadillac Escalade ESV, fully loaded. It pulled to the curb in front of number 14 Sycamore Lane, the Aldersons' old house, which had sold 8 months earlier for $420,000 in a private cash sale, and sat there with the engine running for a full 2 minutes before anyone got out. Then the door opened. Dominic Hargrove was 44 years old, 6'2", with the kind of build that comes from a personal trainer and not from any labor. He wore pressed linen pants and a quarter-zip from a brand that cost more than Eugene's monthly grocery budget. He had the deep tan of a man who vacationed in places where the drinks had umbrellas in them. He surveyed Sycamore Lane the way a developer surveys a vacant lot, calculating. Clinical. Let me tell you about Dominic Hargrove. He'd founded Hargrove Capital Partners in 2009, a real estate and private equity firm based in McLean, Virginia. He specialized in what he called neighborhood repositioning, which was a polished way of saying he bought modest homes in up-and-coming areas, tore them down, and built high-end developments that priced out the people who lived there for decades. He'd done it in Charlottesville. He'd done it in Roanoke. He'd done it in 3 neighborhoods outside D.C. that were now full of wine bars and organic grocery stores and no memory of what they'd been before. He had a wife, Cassandra, who arrived in a separate vehicle, a silver 2020 Mercedes GLE, wearing oversized sunglasses and speaking into a phone she never seemed to put down. He had 2 teenage sons who immediately began throwing a lacrosse ball in the street without looking for traffic. He had a lawsuit pending in Roanoke County for fraudulent property disclosure. He had a code enforcement complaint in Albemarle County still open from 2017. He had a business model built on the very simple premise that most people, when pressured enough, would eventually give up and take whatever he offered. He had never met anyone like Eugene Ray Tillman. His first words on Sycamore Lane were spoken to Mrs. Patricia Chen from number 9, who walked over to welcome him with a plate of lemon bars she'd baked that morning. He looked at the plate, looked at her, said, "We won't be needing anything, we have a caterer," and walked inside. Patricia Chen stood on the sidewalk holding her lemon bars for a long moment. Then she walked back to her house, set the plate on her kitchen counter, and called Eugene on the phone. "Eugene," she said, "we have a problem. It started small, it always does." 2 days after moving in, Dominic Hargrove hired a landscaping company to install a new fence along his property line. This was perfectly legal. The problem was the crew arrived at 6:15 in the morning on a Tuesday with a gas-powered post-hole digger that sounded like a 747 taking off in slow motion. Eugene was already awake, as he always was, but Margaret Flores at number 7 had a 6-week-old baby. Tom Aldrich at number 11 worked night security at the hospital and slept until 10. The crew worked for 4 hours, didn't stop once. Eugene waited until 9 o'clock, put on a clean shirt, walked across the street with Corporal at his side. He knocked on the door. Dominic answered in a monogrammed bathrobe, holding an espresso in a tiny white cup. Eugene introduced himself, explained the noise, explained the baby at number 7, explained that the neighborhood had an informal understanding about construction noise before 8 a.m., offered his hand. Dominic looked at the hand, looked at Eugene, looked at the cane. "Listen, old-timer," he said, "I paid $420,000 for this house. I'll have my fence installed whenever I feel like it, and you might want to check the county ordinance. Legal hours start at 6. He closed the door. Eugene stood there for a moment. Corporal looked up at him with the cloudy eye. "Yep," Eugene said quietly, "that's what I thought." He walked home, went to his workshop, came out 20 minutes later with a small notebook, the kind with a black cardboard cover that composition notebooks use. He wrote the date at the top of the first page, June 25, 2019. He wrote exactly what Dominic Hargrove had said, word for word, as close as he could recall. He wrote the time the crew had arrived, the time they'd left, the equipment used. He put the notebook on the kitchen table next to the salt shaker and a pen. "Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever tried to be reasonable with someone who had absolutely no interest in being reasonable? Someone who mistook your patience for weakness, your calm for surrender? Go ahead and drop it in the comments. I want to know your story. Because what you're about to see is what happens when a man who's been trained to outlast his enemies simply starts the clock." That notebook was the first thing Eugene picked up every morning for the next 14 months. July 4, 2019. Sycamore Lane had held a neighborhood cookout every 4th of July since 1994. Eugene had hosted it in his backyard for the last 11 years. Since Dorothy died, the neighbors had taken over the cooking, and Eugene provided the space, the long folding tables, and the American flags he ran up on 2 poles on either side of the porch. Dominic Hargrove did not come to the cookout. Instead, he hired a DJ and threw his own party in his backyard, which shared a fence line with Eugene's, and ran speakers at a volume that made it impossible to hear the person next to you. He kept it going until 1:15 in the morning. Eugene wrote it down. 2 weeks later, County Health Inspector Dale Burgess arrived at Eugene's door, said he'd received an anonymous complaint about an unlicensed food service operation, specifically the neighborhood cookout. Eugene showed him the backyard, showed him the absence of anything resembling a commercial kitchen. Burgess apologized, said the complaint was clearly frivolous, and left. Eugene noted in his book, Anonymous Complaint, Frivolous, likely source D. Hargrove, 14 Sycamore Lane. In August, Eugene's black 2012 Ford F-150, parked legally in his own driveway, was keyed from the driver's door to the tailgate. A clean, deliberate scratch. Eugene filed a police report. Officer Tammy Briggs from the Harlan's Crossing PD photographed the damage. Eugene's insurance estimated $1,600 to repaint the panel. He wrote it down. In September, Hargrove's attorney sent a certified letter claiming that Eugene's property survey from 1988 was potentially in dispute, and that the survey markers suggested Eugene's workshop, a small, freestanding garage he'd built with his own hands in 1995, may have encroached on Hargrove's property by as much as 2 feet. The letter was 14 pages long, dense with legal language, designed to intimidate. Eugene read it, filed it in a manila folder, called his attorney, a woman named Brenda Choi who operated out of a small office on Merchant Street and who had handled Eugene's estate paperwork after Dorothy died. He also made a second call to a man named Calvin Reese, a retired Army colonel and JAG attorney who lived in Fredericksburg and who owed Eugene a favor dating back to 1991, and a night in Riyadh that neither of them would ever describe in detail. "Calvin," Eugene said, "I need you to pull a copy of the 1988 survey and the 1995 building permit for my workshop." "Problem," Calvin said. "Might be. I'll have it by Thursday. Here's what the survey showed, and this is important, so stay with me. Eugene's workshop did not encroach on Hargrove's property, not by 2 feet, not by 2 inches, not by a single centimeter. The survey was perfectly clean." But Calvin Reese noticed something else in the county records, something he flagged with a yellow highlighter and a small note in the margin that read, "Interesting." He didn't tell Eugene what it was yet, he just said, "Hold on to this, I think it's going to matter." Corporal came home from his afternoon walk in October with a small cut on his right front paw, a piece of glass, the vet said, consistent with a deliberately placed shard. The vet's name was Dr. Angie Pollard, and she treated Corporal for free because she treated Corporal for free for 9 years, and because she knew Eugene Tillman and knew what that old brindle dog meant to a widower who lived alone. Eugene wrote it down. He also installed 3 additional security cameras that week. He now had 6 total: front porch, back porch, driveway, garage, side yard, and 1 position to capture the full width of Sycamore Lane. All of them recorded 4K footage to an encrypted hard drive in his workshop. He'd been doing this since August. He had 4 months of footage already. The cameras were the second thing on Sycamore Lane that nobody thought to ask about. They should have. November came in cold that year. The oak tree dropped its leaves fast, the way it does before a hard winter. Eugene raked them into the compost pile along the back fence, the way he always did, moving slow with the bad leg, Corporal supervising from the porch steps. Along the south side of the house, in a raised cedar bed Eugene had built with his own hands in 2012, grew 7 rose bushes. Dorothy's roses. She'd planted the first 2 the year they moved to Sycamore Lane, added more every anniversary, tended them with a fierce and specific love. She had names for each one, a journal of their bloom cycles, a system of pruning that she'd taught Eugene before she got sick so that someone would keep them going. They bloomed every May, deep red. The whole south side of the house smelled like something you wanted to walk into and never leave. They were the last living thing on earth that Dorothy had touched. On the morning of November 14, 2019, a gray Thursday, frost on the ground, the kind of cold that settles in your bad leg and stays, Eugene woke at 5:45, made his coffee, and looked out the kitchen window toward the south yard. The rose bed was gone. Not overgrown, not damaged. Gone. The cedar planks had been dismantled. The bushes had been pulled up by the roots. The soil had been turned over and raked flat. Where 7 rose bushes had grown for 31 years, there was now a rectangle of cold, bare earth, no bigger than a dining room table. Left behind in the center of that bare earth, a business card. Hargrove Capital Partners, Dominic J. Hargrove, CEO. On the back in blue ink, 2 words. Sell now. Eugene stood at the kitchen window for a very long time. He did not go outside. He did not call the police yet, though he would. He did not raise his voice, though there was no one to raise it to. He picked up the black notebook, wrote the date, the time, a precise description of what he was looking at, set the pen down. Then he picked up his coffee mug, the one that said MY Soldier, and held it in both hands, standing at the window, looking at the bare earth where Dorothy's roses had been. If you think Eugene Ray Tillman was going to let this go, then you've never met a man who has already lost the most important thing in the world, and who has absolutely nothing left to be afraid of. He went to the phone, made 3 calls. The first was to Officer Tammy Briggs. The second was to Calvin Reese. The third was to a number in Washington, D.C. that he hadn't dialed in 11 years. Here's what nobody knew at the time. Let me tell you what Eugene Ray Tillman actually was before he was a retired widower on Sycamore Lane who built birdhouses and drank his coffee in a chipped mug. From 1982 to 1992, Eugene had served as an intelligence analyst attached to the 902nd Military Intelligence Group, the Army's primary domestic counterintelligence unit. His specialty was financial surveillance and asset tracking. For 10 years, it was his job to follow money, to find the thread, to pull it. He was very, very good at it. The third call he made that Thursday morning was to a man named Robert Watkins, formerly Staff Sergeant Robert Watkins, 902nd MIG, Eugene's partner for 7 years in the field. Robert Watkins was now a senior financial crimes investigator with the FBI's Richmond field office. Bobby, Eugene said, I need a favor. Name it, Robert Watkins said, without hesitation, because that's how it works with men who have trusted each other in dark rooms with classified documents and no one else around. You don't ask questions first. Pull everything you can find on Hargrove Capital Partners, McLean, Virginia. CEO named Dominic James Hargrove. There was a pause. Eugene, Robert said slowly, you said Hargrove Capital Partners. Yes. Another pause. Brother, Robert said, I'm going to need you to step back from this one and let me handle it from here. Because here's what Robert Watkins already knew, and what Eugene Tillman was about to find out. Hargrove Capital Partners had been under a federal financial crimes investigation for 19 months. The FBI's White-Collar Crime Division in Richmond, in coordination with the IRS Criminal Investigations Unit and the Virginia Attorney General's Office, had been quietly building a case involving fraudulent property disclosures across 4 Virginia counties, money laundering through a series of shell LLCs, and wire fraud totaling an estimated amount that federal prosecutors had, in a sealed indictment dated October 3, 2019, 6 weeks before the roses were destroyed. Placed at $4.2 million. The sealed indictment was 47 pages long. Dominic James Hargrove's name appeared on page 1. And now he had also committed criminal trespass, destruction of private property, and what Virginia Statute 18.2121 defined as unlawful entry with intent to damage, all of it captured every second on Eugene's 4K security camera positioned along the south side of the house. The footage was time-stamped, clear. Dominic Hargrove in dark clothing at 2:17 in the morning on November 14, 2019, dismantling a cedar planter and pulling 7 rose bushes from the ground. 14 months of documented incidents, 6 cameras, a composition notebook filled with dates, times, and descriptions in Eugene's careful, measured handwriting, a keyed truck with an insurance report, a police report about broken glass and a wounded dog, a spurious health complaint, a fraudulent property survey challenge, an HOA harassment complaint filed in October that the HOA board, which included Patricia Chen, who made lemon bars, had unanimously dismissed. Calvin Reese, JAG attorney, had also now finished reviewing the county property records and found what he'd highlighted in yellow back in September. The survey from 1988 showed something that Dominic Hargrove's attorneys had apparently not caught when they drafted the original fraudulent property dispute letter. Something that would become, in Calvin's words, the funniest thing I have seen in 40 years of real estate law. The fence Dominic Hargrove had installed in June of 2019, his very first act on Sycamore Lane, had been built 14 inches over the property line. Not on Eugene's side. On Hargrove's side. Meaning Dominic Hargrove had spent $12,000 to illegally enclose 14 inches of his own property, and in doing so, had created what Virginia property law identified as an adverse possession trigger on a strip of his own land that Eugene could now, after sufficient legal action, potentially claim. The fence Dominic had built as an act of dominance was going to be used as a weapon against him. Calvin Reese called this development Chekhov's fence. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you watched someone who thought they were the smartest person in the room walk directly into something they built themselves? Tell me in the comments. Because what's coming next, nobody on Sycamore Lane ever forgot it, not for the rest of their lives. It was a Tuesday morning in January 21st, 2020. The sky over Harlan's crossing was the pale gray of old pewter, and the temperature sat at 23 degrees. The oaks on Sycamore Lane were bare, their branches black against the sky, and the street was quiet the way winter streets are quiet, no sprinklers, no kids, no lawn mowers. Eugene Tillman was on his front porch at 6:30 in the morning in his wool coat and his good boots, sitting in the wooden rocker with a cup of coffee. Corporal lay at his feet, wrapped in a plaid blanket Eugene had put there. Their breath made small clouds in the cold air. They heard it before they saw it. Tires on asphalt, more than one vehicle, coming slow and deliberate. 3 vehicles turned onto Sycamore Lane at 6:37 a.m. The first was a black Ford Expedition with federal license plates. The second was a Harlan's Crossing Sheriff's Department cruiser, then a second one behind it. The third vehicle was a white van from the County Code Enforcement Office. Behind them, at a respectful distance, was a single news van from WRIC Channel 8 out of Richmond. Someone had made an anonymous tip. Eugene could not account for who that might have been. The federal vehicle parked in front of number 14 Sycamore Lane. 3 FBI agents in dark jackets, Federal Bureau of Investigation printed in gold across their backs, stepped out. 2 sheriff's deputies, 1 code enforcement officer with a clipboard. 1 process server in a gray overcoat, carrying a manila envelope thick enough to be impressive from across the street. They walked to Dominic Hargrove's front door. The doorbell rang at 6:41 a.m. It took 4 rings. The door opened at 6:48. Dominic Hargrove stepped onto his porch in a gray North Face bathrobe, a mug of espresso in his left hand, his hair uncombed. He looked at the agents, looked at the deputies, looked at the process server. He looked across the street and he saw Eugene Ray Tillman sitting in a wooden rocking chair, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, not watching. Just sitting. The process server handed over the envelope first. 3 separate civil filings, consolidated at the request of the Harlan's Crossing County Circuit Court. The first was a criminal trespass and property damage suit from Eugene Ray Tillman, represented by attorneys Brenda Choi and Colonel Calvin Reese, JAG, retired, seeking $240,000 in compensatory damages plus punitive damages for the deliberate destruction of irreplaceable personal property, specifically 7 rose bushes belonging to the late Dorothy Ann Tillman, planted 1988-2008. The second was a property boundary violation suit, the fence, seeking legal costs, remediation, and adverse possession claim filing on the 14-inch disputed strip. Calvin had called this one the garnish. The third was a civil harassment and nuisance complaint, jointly filed by 11 of the 12 households on Sycamore Lane, documented over 14 months, including the noise violations, the false health complaint, the fraudulent property survey challenge, and the incident involving broken glass and a 9-year-old dog. The total civil claim, $614,000. Then the FBI agents stepped forward. One of them said something to Dominic Hargrove quietly, close, the way agents do when they're not performing for the cameras. He said it with the calm of someone who has said this sentence many times before and feels nothing particular about saying it again. Dominic Hargrove's mug of espresso slipped from his hand and shattered on the porch steps. Cassandra Hargrove appeared in the doorway in a silk robe. One of the teenage sons looked out from an upstairs window. The Channel 8 camera was rolling from a respectful distance, capturing all of it without sound. At 7:14 a.m., the code enforcement officer posted a violation notice on the exterior of the fence: illegal placement, non-compliant structure, removal required within 30 days by county court order, with fines of $200 per day thereafter. At 7:22 a.m., Dominic Hargrove was escorted to the federal vehicle. Not in handcuffs, not that morning. That morning was for paperwork, for coordination, for the formal reading of charges in a federal building on West Broad Street in Richmond. The handcuffs would come 7 weeks later, on the morning the sealed indictment was unsealed and the arrest warrant executed. But he left Sycamore Lane in the back of a federal vehicle on a cold Tuesday morning in January. And Eugene Ray Tillman sat on his porch and drank his coffee. He didn't watch the car leave. He was looking at the south side of his house, where the cedar bed used to be. He was thinking about Dorothy. The street went quiet after the vehicles left. Then one by one the doors opened. Patricia Chen came out first, still in her housecoat. Then Tom Aldrich from number 11, still in his work uniform from the night shift he'd just come home from. Margaret Flores with the baby on her hip. Old Bill Yarrow from number 3, who was 81 and hadn't moved that fast in years. They came out quietly, the way people come out after a storm, carefully into sudden stillness. They gathered without planning to, in the street in front of Eugene's house. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Patricia Chen walked up the porch steps and put her hand on Eugene's arm. He patted her hand, nodded. That was all. The Hargrove house was silent. The pearl-white Escalade sat in the driveway, the silver Mercedes sat behind it, the lights upstairs were on. Nobody from inside came out. Nobody on the street went over. The code violation notice fluttered against the illegal fence in the January wind. Sycamore Lane went about its Tuesday. Over the next 6 weeks, the moving truck came on a Saturday morning in early March. No fanfare, no announcement. The same 3-truck convoy that had arrived 7 months earlier, now in reverse, carrying out the furniture, the espresso machine, the things that had filled that house without ever belonging to it. Cassandra Hargrove directed the movers from the porch, still on her phone. The boys sat in the Mercedes on their own phones. None of the neighbors came outside. No one waved. The Escalade and the Mercedes left at 2 in the afternoon. The moving trucks followed, and number 14 Sycamore Lane sat empty and quiet as the light faded. Nobody said good riddance out loud. They didn't have to. In April of 2020, the federal charges against Dominic James Hargrove were unsealed. Wire fraud, money laundering, fraudulent property disclosure in 4 Virginia counties, conspiracy to commit securities fraud through falsified asset valuations across 19 properties held by Hargrove Capital Partners and 5 subsidiary LLCs. The total value of the fraud, $4.2 million as estimated. He was arrested on the morning of April 9th, charged on 11 federal counts, released on a $400,000 bond which he posted. His trial began in October 2020. On December 3rd, the jury returned verdicts on 9 of 11 counts. Guilty. He was sentenced the following February, 37 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, restitution of $4.2 million, and permanent disbarment from serving as a principal or officer of any registered real estate investment entity in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The civil case settled out of court in August 2020, after a mediator reviewed 14 months of documented incidents, 6 cameras of 4K footage, a composition notebook, a veterinary report, an insurance claim, 11 household affidavits, and a business card left in a rose bed at 2:17 in the morning. The settlement total, $847,000 plus legal fees. Eugene gave $20,000 to the Veterans Shelter in Richmond. He gave another $20,000 to Dr. Angie Pollard's clinic, designated for care of animals owned by veterans and fixed-income seniors. He put the rest in a trust for his grandchildren. He used $4,000 for one specific purpose. In May of 2021, on what would have been his and Dorothy's 43rd wedding anniversary, Eugene rebuilt the cedar planter along the south side of the house. He hired a landscaper to source 7 rose varieties matching Dorothy's originals as closely as records allowed. He planted them himself, with his bad leg and his cane, on his knees in the good dark soil, on a warm morning that smelled like rain coming. He didn't rush. The roses bloomed the following spring. Deep red, every one of them. Number 14 Sycamore Lane sold to a young couple in September 2020, a schoolteacher named Amara Osai and her husband Daniel, a firefighter. They came to Eugene's door their first week with a casserole and a bottle of Virginia red wine. He invited them in. He fed them coffee and told them about the street, about the neighbors, about the cookout on the 4th of July that had run every year since 1994. He told them about Patricia's lemon bars. He did not tell them everything else. They didn't need to know. Sycamore Lane was peaceful again. That was enough. Corporal passed away in February of 2021 in his sleep on the same plaid blanket he'd always used. He was 10 years old, which is a good long life for a brindle mutt with one cloudy eye and an opinion about everything. Eugene buried him in the backyard under the oak tree. He put a small birdhouse on the fence above the spot, one he'd made himself in the workshop on a quiet afternoon in January when the light came through the window just right. He's still on Sycamore Lane. Still drinking his coffee at 5:45. Still waving at every car. You know, folks, people talk about power like it's something that comes from what you own. How much money's in the account. How many properties you've bought and sold and flipped and renamed and repositioned and profited from. Dominic Hargrove had $230 million. He had attorneys and shell companies and a pearl white Escalade and all the espresso he could drink. And he walked into a 51-year-old brick house on a quiet street and looked at a 71-year-old man with a cane and a cloudy-eyed dog and a chipped coffee mug, and he saw weakness. He did not see the notebook. He did not see the cameras. He did not see the 40 years of training that teaches a man how to be still and patient and invisible, while the evidence builds itself into something that cannot be argued away. He did not see that the man he was trying to break had already survived things that would have destroyed Dominic Hargrove in an afternoon. He did not see that the rose bed was not just a garden. It was aligned. And the moment he crossed it, Eugene Ray Tillman, quietly, deliberately, without raising his voice even once, began the process of making sure that crossing that line was the most expensive mistake Dominic Hargrove ever made. You see, folks, real strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rev an engine or slam a door or send a 14-page lawyer's letter or leave a business card in the dirt where something beautiful used to grow. Real strength sits on a porch in January in a wool coat and drinks its coffee and watches the sun come up. And waits. Never mistake a quiet man for a weak man. Never mistake patience for permission. And never pick a fight with a veteran who has already decided that his honor is the one thing he will not negotiate on. Not for $230 million. Not for $1. Not for anything. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me about the neighbor you dealt with, the moment you decided enough was enough, the day you stopped being reasonable with someone who wasn't worth your reasonableness. And if you want to see more stories like this one, you know where the subscribe button is. Take care of yourselves out there. This story is inspired by real events and public court records. Names, locations, and specific details have been changed or dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental.